Hello, class. My name is Jason Ismail, and I'm going to be talking about the Aryan Indians and their sacrificial altars. This project actually was a little strange to work on. I didn't really expect to find what I found about the Indians. They they made these beautiful altars, and they had very interesting proportions. They were all mathematically perfect, and their use was to sacrifice not only animals but humans on there. And there was a lot of what the and oh my goodness, what over and over again as I looked up information on this topic. So we'll see what we can do about going through all this information and keeping it on the light side. But it's kind of a heavy topic. Between 2000 and 1000 BC, the Aryan Indians decided that they wanted to conquer northern India. Before then, they were basically nomadic tribes following around their cattle, which they had found to be sacred. But for whatever reason, they desired what the northern Indians had, and they brought advanced weaponry with them. They had bronze weapons, while the northern Indians only had stonework. They also had horse-drawn chariots, which made it very, very easy for them to conquer northern India. The influx of Aryan Indians continued for 1,000 years. And during that time, the Aryan Indians assimilated with the native population. They all got together and they shared their beliefs. The Aryan Indians took on many of their religious ideas, including the altars that the natives were creating for human sacrifices and so forth. This constant influx of people caused northern India to become incredibly crowded. And when, of course, things get too crowded, everybody decides to move, right? And so you'll notice a really large change in the population. They all began to filter down into southern India together, and they created all these different societies like Kerala, which we'll be learning about shortly, and India as a whole just continued to become super condensed and populated. This is where the math gets exciting. So the ancient Aryan Indians have a very similar number system to ours. They had a 1 through 9 number system, which was used exclusively by the Brahmin priests. And there's also a shift in a way of thinking for the Aryan Indians versus the Greeks. The Greeks, of course, were all into proving and the perfection of math, and the Aryan priests were really into just being accurate. They didn't really care about the proofs per se. So there's a shift from using geometry based ideas to using more algebraic ones, because they are really interested in the end result. They want their altars to be perfect. They want them to be a certain size, and so they use math to achieve their goals. The Aryan Indians' use of algebraic concept should not be interpreted as a lack of wanting to use geometry, because they did use geometry. This is one of the most famous altars that they sacrificed animals and people on. And as you can see, it's made up of very, very specific bricks. They're specific shapes that were cut out, and they all served a very specific purpose. We have parallelograms. We have other shapes where, like on the face of the bird, we have these shapes that could be used to create rectangles, and everything had a very specific angle and so forth. And all these blocks were intended to be a very, very specific size and shape and so forth. There was no, if they had made a mistake here, then the gods would be angry, and they didn't want that. They also understood the concepts of the Pythagorean theorem and other area type problems, including on this altar there would be a fire pit where they would cook their victims and consume their victims. And the fire pit's dimensions, the actual area, had to be the same area as a circle. And so they had this concept where they needed to figure out the area of a circle and attribute it to the area of a square. And so they're not opposed to using geometry, and they did use it pretty extensively, but there's definitely a shift in thinking toward an algebraic one, because everything that they did was not for the love of the numbers. It was more for getting the results, because they were very, very result oriented. I found it very interesting that the ancient Indians had the exact same issues that the Greeks had. They were concerned with squaring the circle, which we just now discovered on their altars. They had the circle and square that they wanted the exact same area, and that's that problem. The other issue that they had was the doubling of a cube. At one point, the Aryans were faced with a horrific plague, and the story goes that they basically cried out to their gods and asked what they could possibly do to stop this horrible thing from happening to them. And the oracles came back and said, well, the gods told us that we need a bigger altar. We need it to be double the altar size, and it needs to be exactly the same proportion as it was before. So they end up with the exact same issue as the squaring the cube idea, right? They need to, or doubling the cube, sorry, doubling the cube idea, to where they want to take this object and increase its size. This is where the history gets a little hazy. I couldn't tell whether they actually solved the problem or not. I know that they got kicked over to Plato, and he wasn't sure how to solve it, so he shuffled them off to other mathematicians and philosophers and so forth. But I didn't actually find whether they actually solved their problem. I know that the problem was solved later in the 6th century, and the way that they solved it was actually pretty cool. If you take a square and you figure out what the diagonal of that square is, then you can take that diagonal and you can create another square out of that diagonal, and that square will be exactly double the first square, which is great. So it does get solved. I just was not sure whether they actually got to use that information. So it was probably this great quest, that they went on and just kept on going. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys had a great time. I certainly did. It was a lot of information here, and yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask.